Hello, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. Um, I know that you told me that you're going to do your best to help me make these ideas presentable and shareable, and I'm very gracious, and I hope it's possible. Though I hold in my mind the possibility that it isn't, especially in this paradigm, because, read the title. My presentation is called the Post-It As An Amulet. It doesn't fit very well in our current paradigm. I still hope you enjoy it. Excuse me. Loose leaf tea. Anyways, let's begin. I recently went back and I listened to a lecture you gave in Berlin recently, a presentation about Scrum at scale. I wanted to do my research. I didn't want to make any inept analogies today. And what really stuck out to me the most was when you started talking about coding algorithms for fractals and having to include a recursive algorithm, or else the whole thing was just going to fall apart. And what I immediately recognized is that you were describing a holographic situation, wherein the part exchanges with and conditions the whole, and the whole exchanges with and conditions the part. Now, I intend to argue that the reason Scrum is so effective is because it favors holarchy to hierarchy. And in doing so, it aligns itself with the processes of open systems physics. I believe that biological systems are some of the best examples of these open feedback loops, very complex open feedback loops. Now, to make my argument, I'm going to be drawing pretty heavily from the works of these three brilliant-minded men, Dr. Joseph P. Farrell, Dr. William A. Tiller, and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas E. Bearden. These authors here also heavily inspired my thought processes, even though I don't reference them directly in the presentation, but I wanted to leave them there as a reference, because not many of my thoughts are original here. It's just that I'm making connections between what you're doing at Scrum and what I see as a much bigger picture. Now, all of those thinkers, they're all in agreement that modern physics is a little whack right now. That it's totally horribly one-sided towards a materialistic cosmology. And in my opinion, you're bound to make egregious errors if your analysis is solely based on the material world. And here's why. I'm a big fan of former Secretary Catherine Austin Fitts, and she's been going on for years about how there's a hidden system of finance in our country. And this isn't news, but if you're going to be a financial analyst, if you're going to do a financial analysis of our budget and you're only going to use the publicly available data, you are bound to make some egregious errors because you're only dealing with 50% of the system. And the same holds true with modern physics. If you make the mistake in assuming that our physical world is the only reality, you're only dealing with the part of the system, and so you're bound to make egregious errors. Now, Dr. William Tiller proposes that there are at least two levels of our physical reality. The first being our conventional everyday reality of 3D space, the electric, the particulate, the atom, the electron, etc. But the second level of reality, you can consider it more like an information field, potentially magnetic in nature, resembling in some respects the ether luminiferous of 19th century physics. Now, this second level of reality would include Maxwell's infolded scalar potentials, or stressors in the medium. And if it's true, it implies that our current physics has either intentionally obscured or inadvertently thrown out one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. And when you do that, when you forget that there's the second level of reality, what you end up doing is leading yourself into the fallacy, the all-pervasive philosophy of materialistic cosmology, because you think that our world, the 3D world of conventional experience, is the only reality there is. Now, if you run with the assumption that there are these two levels of reality, they imply a third level of reality, because in order for those two levels to have any meaningful interaction, there has to be a coupling medium. And in Tiller's words, this coupling medium is of a higher dimensionality than the 3D space of conventional experience. If you haven't realized it yet, the implication here is that our consciousness is the coupling medium. Excuse me, morning. And Scrum and Agile processes rely on that human component. They rely on real human interaction in teams. And my opinion is that this is because humans are the coupling mechanism between our environs and the second level, the information field of reality. In turn, if you're going to have any formal description of this process, you have to be able to show the inherently analogical thought processes of an intelligent observer in the medium itself. Can you think off the top of your head of a way to formally express the inherent analogical thoughts, memories, emotions, and experiences of intelligent observers? Let's see, I'll give you a hint. User stories. I hope you were thinking it, because they are a perfect example in my mind. You are formally expressing every step of the way through a user's experience, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, how they're approaching their environment, and whatever the product is that you're designing as a team. I don't think it's an accident. I don't think it's an accident that Scrum and Agile processes are so in line with the natural way of things. Just like I don't think it's an accident that the Agile Manifesto was published in 2001 at the dawning of the millennium. I'll leave it there. Now, if we're going to dig a little deeper into Bearden's work, we have to recognize, oh, I shouldn't have shown you the slide. I can't go backwards. I'm recording. Never mind. Anyways, we have to recognize that he's suggesting that the biological systems utilize an internalized electromagnetic energy to coordinate their living communications between mental and physical processes. So, in my mind, I think we also see an analog here to Scrum at scale. Because when you're scaling Scrum, we use open feedback loops between the Scrum teams and the Meta Scrum teams, and instead of an instantaneous internalized communication of electrical signals, we're actually structuring our communication through Scrum events, stand-up meetings, sprint plannings, etc. Right? It's still structured. It's important to recognize that the quantum level that is the information field is still structured. It's not unstructured. And the correlation between the electromagnetic signaling will become even more clear when we dig into a coherent team's efficacy and an incoherent team's efficacy. And what's coherency? What's a coherent wave of light? A laser, right? Because all the photons are marching in step. But incoherent light, it bounces all over the place. It doesn't get a lot done. I mean, it helps us see. But I see Scrum Masters as being tasked with tuning the team to the frequency of the product owner. And the product owner, in turn, is tuning the customer to the team, while the Agile Manifesto values are enabling teams with coherency. And I think it's also important to note here that part of the structure, part of this equilibria and dynamic structure within this particle flux is the mind. It is the emotions, at least according to Lieutenant Colonel Bearden. And here's the picture right here, where I see it pretty clearly, that communication system between cells and subsystems and super subsystems that is an internalized electromagnetic signaling within the organism is a direct analog to the feedback loops in Scrum at scale. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Rupert Sheldrake before. He's a biologist at Cambridge. He's a brilliant man and a brilliant orator, so I totally recommend you check out one of his talks. Morphogenetic fields are his theory, and they're so full of good nuggets of information. Just send your mind reeling. Anyways, Bearden even ties the scalar potential to species-specific electromagnetic information. I don't know if you caught that or not, but Sheldrake's morphogenetic field is pure and simply a species quantum potential created amongst the members of a species. As experiences are met by the individual members, they steadily input enfolded electromagnetic structures into the inner electromagnetic channels of that quantum potential. As more of the same detrimental changes are experienced over generations, or maybe as the same impediments are experienced in several different Scrum teams and then brought up in the meta-Scrum, the countering signal structures residing in the species' quantum potential will be increasing over the same period of time. Gradually, the hidden electromagnetic structure, which is like billions of tiny little vacuum engines, is changing and internally structuring the Schrödinger potential for that species. One could also say that the space-time potential occupied by the species members is now sufficiently curved and structured to serve a specific signal pattern energetic source for genetic change. Reaching this threshold causes specific new genetic changes to occur in the entire species in a single jump. Now, what Bearden's describing here, it's very closely aligned to Stephen Gould's theory of punctuated equilibrium in evolution. I do ascribe to evolutionary theory, but I prefer punctuated equilibrium. I prefer Gould's thinking to a gradualism, simply because it gets rid of that circular logic. Who survives? The fittest. Who is the fittest? He who survives. Anyways, I know the implications are totally wild, because what Bearden is saying is that it's the quantum potential that engineers a species, that engineers a genetic change, and the mind reels. I'll leave it there though, because we're just going to deal with the analogs. Bearden is suggesting that evolution in a species occurs because the quantum engines in that second level of reality, which Tiller proposes, are working until they reach a threshold, and then they influence the whole population all at once. Now, if we consider the species here to be our product, in Scrum, the product doesn't necessarily evolve gradually. I remember distinctly in the lecture you gave about Scrum at scale that Scrum works when the object it focused on by each team, by each level of your organization is the same object. You can't be focusing on two different objects on two different goals, because you create this incoherencies between the team. If you're following my analogy here, I've suggested that the Scrum of Scrums and the product owner meta Scrum are analogs to the quantum engines of the medium. Meta Scrum meetings are attempts to engineer the medium, which we could consider the will and the direction for the next daily Scrum, by removing impediments so that all the Scrum teams in the system can jump together into the next daily Scrum. In turn, the product then evolves not gradually, but by jumping. Now, let's take a step back and review the implications of Bearden's work. Keep in mind that I recognize the physics I'm proposing is normally rejected by modern science because of a strict one-sidedness in favor of a materialistic cosmology. However, good science relies on empiricism, and empiricism doesn't necessitate materialism. I'll include several examples of experiments run by both Bearden and Tiller. However, I know we need more tests with control groups and proper form in order to truly validate these theories. So here we've got a quick summary of what Bearden is saying and what the implications of this are. First off, the part exchanges with and conditions the whole, and the whole exchanges with and conditions the part. And the implication here is that all physics is open systems physics, with complex feedback loops between whole and parts of a system. And biological systems are the best example of this. Now, these relationships arise in turn from local enfolded scalar potential of the local structured vacuum flux, or zero-point energy, i.e., This gives rise to and structures all matter in complex systems, including and especially life and ultimately consciousness. Here's the boldest statement of the whole thing. Evolution is thus primarily a physics phenomenon, not a biological one, and is subject to the structuring of local potential, and thus it is conceivable to have a genetics engineering wholly on the basis of engineering the local structured potential. And finally, note particularly that the living aspects of a biosystem, mind, thoughts, memories, lives, emotions, personality, etc., themselves may be regarded as equilibria and dynamic structure in the deeper nested levels of the virtual particle flux of vacuum space-time. Therefore, mind itself is the ultimate structuring of this local potential, and hence, the implication is that one should design experiments to detect its operation or effect on local space and matter in it. It is precisely what Tiller sets out to do, and I'm about to describe to you some of the experiments that Tiller conducted to demonstrate his theory. So here I'm including some of the experiments that they've run, and I'm sure you've run across some experiences of intentionality before in your work or just your day-to-day life. You've probably heard of the rice experiment. You sterilize 3 jars, you put equal parts of white rice in each jar, and then you hate on one jar, you love on the other, and you ignore the control group. And what occurs is that the hate jar gets all moldy and nasty, and the love jar is super clean, and the control group is kind of in the middle. Now, I've debated whether I should just read directly out of here work to you, or whether I should do a quick summary. I'm going to include in the email I'm sending you the link to the webinar where I got some of this information from Dr. Joseph P. Farrell if you want to explore it on your own accord. But I'm just going to touch on the basics. So the way Tiller ran his experiments. I'm going to make sure it's Tiller. It might have been Bearden, and I'm not actually certain right now. Psychowit is Tiller. It's Tiller. Tiller ran these experiments. He used a group of people. And I know I've told you before, like when I was introducing this concept at the dinner table, I was focusing on the group multiplier effect. And when I sat down and tried to put together my notes on the group multiplier effect, I realized that I don't know why it works, and I don't know how to describe why it works. I just know from experience that it does. I think it has something to do with cosmology, with however you believe creation occurs. If there's like a nebulous, undifferentiated nothing, and then you start to differentiate it, and what you create are several different nodes, and they all share several functions, but they're all unique. I'll leave it at that. Anyways, there's a lot in common with these experiments with sacramental ritual and doctrine. And when you perform ritual sacraments, you perform them as a group. And what Tiller did is he found 4 coherent individuals, 2 women, 2 men. And a coherent individual, in my mind, and in Tiller's mind, is a good person, a person who does their best to align their actions and their heart and their mind, and who has a steady meditation process, because that helps do all those things. It helps make you coherent. So you got 4 coherent people, and they all started meditating. They got into a meditative state, and then he had a device that they were going to imprint intentionality on. I mean, I know it's nutty. I know it's so nutty, but they had this little device. Let me see if I can find an explanation of this device. The actual consciousness imprinting was performed by 4 humans from a deep meditative state. One host device, labeled a UED, unimprinted electrical device, was placed on a tabletop and plugged into its electrical power converter, which was, in turn, plugged into a wall socket. The UED was switched to on. 4 well-qualified meditators, 2 men and 2 women, sat around this table readying themselves to enter the silence. When the signal was given, all 4 closed their eyes, proceeded to mentally connect coherently with each other, the unseen universe, and the UED. Then they mentally cleansed the environment in order to create a sacred space around the device into which a specific intention was to be placed. In all cases, I had previously prepared a specific written intention statement for the UED on the tabletop. When the environment felt calm, coherent, clean, peaceful, and bathed in light, I would read the specific intention statement to the group. Each member of the group would mentally visualize the particulars of the intention in their own way, while I would continuously mentally scroll the key items of this intention statement through my mind for the duration of this phase in the process. After approximately 15 minutes in this state, with our attention on the host device, if everything felt right, I would say, "So be it, thy will be done." And we would all abruptly release our focus on the device but stay in that deep, coherent state. Then I would read a subsidiary intention statement for sealing the primary intention imprint onto the host device without any unnecessary wasteful leakage of this key information during either use or storage. And then what did they do? They then placed this intentionality imprinted device, and they did at least 2 experiments. They actually did 3, but I'm going to include here right now. They had to do with a glass of water. And they used control groups, etc. too, but the specific written intention statement said that they wanted to change the pH of the water. And then they put the water in a dark room next to the device. And in the water pH experiments, the water exposed to the 2 different intentionality imprinted electric devices significantly increased or decreased pH levels depending on which device it was exposed to, within the parameters of the experiment when exposed to the devices for a period of approximately 11 days. They were able to change the pH of the water by thinking it. And then they did another one with thermodynamics. And then the in vitro thermodynamic study indicated that when exposed to an IIED, those imprinted intentions was to increase activity of the enzyme ALP, that within 30 minutes of exposure to such an IIED, ALP activity increased approximately 15%. They also did it with fruit flies, like trying to increase the rate of reproduction in the fruit flies. And it worked too, which is it's totally bizarre. I know it sounds bizarre. I know it sounds like pseudoscience. And that's why I mentioned that we need more experiments. And just for some additional fun and all. So clearly the experiments that Tiller ran closely resemble religious sacrament, religious ritual. And if you haven't realized this yet, the reason I believe that sacrament works, the reason I believe Scrum works, the reason I believe that these experiments run by Tiller and Bearden worked, has something to do with the nature of the cosmos, with the composition of the cosmos, with the inherent relationships between consciousness and the cosmos. And the only difference between what you're doing in Scrum processes, between what's happening in the religious ritual, between what's happening in the experiments run by Bearden and Tiller, the difference is that in Scrum and in the experiments run by Tiller and Bearden, the imprinted intentionality is scientifically explicit and it's concerned with material change. Another difference is the form and the context in which these processes occur, because clearly in the experiment, they were trying to create a sacred space. They focused heavily on meditating. And in religious ritual, you are on sacred ground. That's a part of the context. It's a part of the agreed upon intentionality of the ritual between all members in the group. And those are the 3 important categories. I don't know if I listed them all, but the 3 important categories in taking advantage of this inherent entanglement between consciousness and matter. What's required is proper form, proper matter, and proper intention. And I'm just going to give you a couple of quick examples, compare and contrast proper form, matter, and intention in Christian sacramental tradition, contrasted to what happens in a Scrum meeting. I got to pull up my notes real quick. Okay, so proper form. This includes time. When are you going to meet? For how long are you going to meet? For what reason are you meeting? And there's tons of structured form in Scrum. You've got 5 specific events. and you run them at specific intervals and at specific times, the same time every day sometimes, right? Now, proper form in the Christian sacramental tradition is saying the proper prayers agreed upon by the whole congregation and the whole church denomination at large. You're also agreeing upon a text, right? You've got the Bible in the Christian tradition. Maybe you've got the Agile Manifesto in Scrum. Now, proper matter. This is another aspect that's important. In the Bearden experiments, this was your unimprinted electric device, and then in tandem, your intentionality imprinted electric device. And the proper matter in a Christian sacramental tradition would be unleavened bread and wine from grapes. Now, proper matter in Scrum processes, I don't think I need to even say it. The Post-it note, the Sharpie, your masking tape on the wall. This is the matter that gets imprinted with the group's intentionality. Because don't we use Post-it notes for every aspect that we want to accomplish? Every task that we need to get done, we put it on a sticky note. It's visual for everybody in the group. Proper matter. Now, and finally, proper intention. In Christian sacrament, proper intention, the intention of the ritual is for spiritual development, to grow closer to God, to be united with God. In Scrum processes, the intention is more goal-oriented, it's process-oriented, it's product-oriented. Your intention is something that can be quantified and measured step by step. But to conclude in summary one more time, the reason I believe it is so effective and it works so well is because open systems physics, one, is an analog to it. The system, Scrum processes are very similar to biological processes in the way that they communicate with each other. There's a clear analogy there in my mind. And also, not just is there this analogy to the process between how biological systems communicate and how Scrum at scale organizations communicate with all their subsystems, but there's something more. The entanglement between consciousness and the medium is really capitalized in the Scrum processes because there is such a focus on the people aspect, on the team, on creating coherent teams that work well together, that trust each other. It's focused on that human element. It understands that human consciousness as the coupling mechanism between our information field and the physical medium is key. That is the source. Humans are the source of human creativity, and human creativity is what has changed, is what has created the shape of progress. So progress and evolution, like progress comes from an evolutionary mindset, but when you get stuck in gradualism, you think that ideas gradually evolve. But this isn't how ideas work at all in the real world. Technology and creativity jumps and leaps and bounds. It's night and day when you get a new idea. It's not a linear correlation. And you're able to capitalize on that when you use Scrum processes, because Scrum processes in their very design allow for jumps. They don't just allow for jumps, they're designed to create jumps, right? Because you're trying to, in one day, get rid of all the impediments of that day so that the next day you can jump even further along in your product design. I think that's incredible. I think that's profound and insightful. And this is the reason why Scrum is not solely applicable to software. It's why it's applicable to so many other fields, infinite fields, because it is so in line with the composition of the universe, and the composition of the universe influences every context. Every context can go back to the fundamental composition of the universe. Thank you for your time. Thank you too for your patience, and for indulging in this video presentation medium instead of something a bit more textual. I look forward to your feedback, and I don't want you to feel any rush in replying right away if you're super busy. Thank you again.
Family.
I chose a musical transition because I had finished this whole presentation. I'll be honest with you, I'm doing this before class this morning, so I need to finish up so I can get ready for class. But something that frustrated me throughout this whole presentation is that I had told you I was going to describe the group multiplier effect versus the individual observer as they're tracking information from one context to another. And I spent hours yesterday and several hours this morning. I woke up before it got light outside. I didn't set an alarm, mind you. I just woke up. Preparing this presentation, and I still, for the life of me, could not integrate how the group multiplier effect even works. I could not find an example of it in real life in my mind. I just knew that I had observed it work, and that's how ritual sacraments work. You have to have more than one person normally. It's even in Scrum, you need a team. You can't have one individual doing Scrum necessarily, right? Well, I've got it. And it does have to do with cosmology, with what Joseph Farrell calls and what I call the topological metaphor, and the implications of that. And I kind of mentioned it before when I was getting at how an amulet would work and why. Anyway, here are the implications of the topological metaphor. And if you want some more information on it, I'll just make you a whole new slideshow about this analogy because it's fundamental. It really integrates itself into every element of your life once you truly understand it. It revolutionizes your thinking. Oh, I just want to say one more thing. It's the coolest thing for me is that we've got a little cortex between our neocortex and our hippocampus. And when you map the neural electrical signals go interacting between what is this, your decision-making process and your memories, well, guess what shape it makes? Torus. What shape the electromagnetic field is? A torus. What shape do I think consciousness enters as when there's nothing and then existence comes out of nothing? A spiral. A torus. It's just too cool. Anyway, the implications of the topological metaphor are: one, let me use the microphone so that we can hear each other. One, every context conditions a statement, and I don't only use statement in the usual sense, but as any object, any formal principle, material, etc. The context itself conditions the object and the perception of it. And for me, this is why you can't figure out the rules or the velocity of your Scrum team or the project that you're encountering until you start it, because the rules unfold out of the system, but you can't determine the rules of a system before the system starts to exist. And a system is dynamic, and so the rules become a bit dynamic as they unfold. They are unfolded. The second implication of this metaphor that I would love to delve into with you is that there is no difference as you can begin to think analogically between how an individual tracks information and from one context to another and the way a group does it. My suggestion here is that there's an analog between an individual doing this. The analog here is like a serial circuit in electricity. That's how an individual would track information from context to context. But when you get a group of individuals doing this, the analog is much closer to a parallel circuit, as you can see in this image. Also, an individual tracking an analogical statement through several contexts is going to end up with a lower order derivative, whereas a group observer noticing several contextual applications is going to end up with a higher order of the very same thing. There's a group multiplier effect of the group observer, of several individuals focusing on this process itself. And I hope you can see the implications of what Dr. Tiller's work found out in connection to this idea right here. 3, there's a potential impact of the mind and intention on matter. In order to make this scientific, we do need to make more tests. And the last implication is that all the ancient cosmologies, when they described the universe as a living being, They meant it, but I think they might have meant it more as a metaphor than as something to be taken literally. If you take it literally, I guess you'd have to say that the universe is a living being. But if it's a metaphor, then what they're even the ancient cosmologies were really hinting at is that they recognize this open systems physics, these complex open feedback loops between the micro and the macro. That's it. That's what I wanted to share. This specifically, that yes, an individual observer is going to have a lower order derivative of understanding when they track a statement, an object, a material, a formal principle, right? Through context to another context. And a group observer is going to have a higher order derivative. The connection here being series versus parallel. And if you read Poetic Diction by Owen Barfield, he makes the point that you can read a poem and experience something, and then a couple days later come back and read that same poem and you don't experience it. And why is this? Because that knowledge that is gained, that is esoteric, that is not directly in the words in the poem, it's gained by moving from one state of consciousness to another. When an individual is tracking a statement, they're tracking it from one context to another. Their understanding is more than the sum of that statement and the two contexts. That's what the coupling mechanism implies. What your understanding is always going to be more than the sum of the parts that got you there. What an organization's design process is always going to be more than the sum of its parts. That's all I've got to say. Thank you again. Now I'm going to end the postscript.